Very good morning to our many students. Welcome to our Zoology online class. And this class is only for the science group students. Okay. So listen, students. The last class we studied about some important 2 mark questions and one experiment also. Okay. You remember the experiments and some 2 mark and 3 mark questions also. I hope you all studied that questions. Okay, now we are going to study about one very important 5 mark questions. Today we are going to study about only one question. It's a 5 mark question. Very important for 5 mark question. Listen very carefully. Today our topic is isolating mechanism. Isolating mechanism. First I say the definition for this isolating mechanism. Here isolating mechanism meaning. Isolation meaning is a separation of the members of a single population into subpopulations. Okay, so the separation of the members from a single population into subpopulations is called isolation. Okay, say just imagine it's a main population, single population. This single population is divided into two subpopulations. So, the members of these two subpopulations are closely related members, closely related species, because once upon a time the members of these two subpopulations were lived together, okay, togetherly in a single population. So the members of a single population is divided into two subpopulations. Now the members of these two subpopulations are closely related members, closely related species. Okay, and these two subpopulations, the members of these two subpopulations are maintaining their genetic creativity. Okay, genetic materials are they are maintaining properly. Understand of you? And because of some barriers means in Tamil we can say tadai. Okay, so because of some barriers, the reproduction between the members of these two subpopulations is prevented. Okay, so the because of some reasons or because of some barriers, the interbreeding between the members of the two subpopulations is prevented. Understand of you? Understand? So it's a small introduction about this isolation mechanism. Then, this isolation mechanism is divided into two main categories. One is the pre-psychotic isolation and the second one is the post-psychotic isolation. Okay, so pre-psychotic isolation and post-psychotic isolation, these two are the important category of this isolation mechanism. So now we are going to study about 9 isolation mechanism, 9 types of isolation. Okay, so the first one is, listen very carefully, very important for 5 marks. First one is ecological isolation. Okay, see the ecological isolation is otherwise called habitat isolation. Habitat meaning living place. Habitat meaning living place. So ecological isolation or habitat isolation meaning differences in their habitat or differences in their living place. Okay, so because of the differences in the living place, closely related species are not involved in reproduction, or the interbreeding between the closely related species is prevented because of the differences in the living place or habitat. Some of you see two examples here I have written. Rana areolata and Rana graolio. Okay, so these two are the closely related frog species. Okay, Rana areolata and Rana graolio. So these two are the closely related frog species. Okay, listen here. This species maximum occupy the burrows created by the mammals and tortoise. And maximum these species living in the shallow pond water. Shallow means depthless pond water. But this species, this Rana graolio, live in the deep region of the water. So this is living in the shallow region. This is living in the deep, okay, living in deepest region of the water body. So the living place of these two closely related species is different. So because of this reason, the reproduction between these two species is prevented. Okay, reproduction between these two species is prevented. So I hope you understood this ecological isolation. Ecological isolation meaning differences in the habitat. Then second isolation is called seasonal isolation. Because of the differences in the season, the reproduction between the living organisms closely related species is prevented. See, for example, Buffo americanus and Buffo fowleri. Okay, so Buffo americanus and Buffo fowleri. So these two are the closely related species. Okay, closely related species. Here, this Buffo americana involved in the reproduction activity during the beginning of spring season. Okay, during the beginning of spring season, during the early period of spring season. But this Buffo fowleri species, okay, doing the reproduction activities during the later period of spring season. Okay, so the seasons of the reproduction, because of the differences in the season, the interbreeding or the differences is what prevented. Okay, is prevented. So this is called seasonal isolation. Understand a few? Then next, third, sexual isolation or behavioral isolation. Listen very carefully. Here, sexual isolation meaning differences in the sexual behaviors and sexes. So because of the differences in the sexual activities or sexual behaviors, and also because of the differences in the sex cells, the reproduction between the closely related species is prevented. So it is called sexual isolation. So third isolation. Then fourth one is morphological isolation. See, morphological isolation meaning, see, differences in the, because of some differences in the size of the external genital organs. The external genital organs means external reproductive organs. So because of the differences in the size of the external reproductive organs, the interbreeding between the two closely related species is arrested or prevented. Understand a few? Understand? So this is called morphological isolation. Okay, this is called morphological isolation. So here example, Buffo curicus and Buffo basiceps. Okay, so these two are the closely related species, but the size of the external reproductive organs of these two species is different. So unable to involve in the sexual reproduction. So the reproduction is prevented. Then next one is physiological isolation. See, physiological isolation meaning, in this type of isolation, reproduction is takes place. That means mating is takes place, but the gametes are prevented from fertilization. Gametes are not allowed to join together. So listen very carefully. So in this type of physiological isolation, the reproduction or the mating is takes place, but the gametes are not involved in the fertilization. The gametes are not involved in the fusion. Understand you? So this isolation is called physiological isolation. Example, Drosophila berylis and Drosophila americana. Okay, so these two are the insect species. So these two species, insect species, the reproduction or the interbreeding is prevented. Okay, is prevented. Then next one is cytological isolation. The sixth isolation is called cytological isolation. See, the cytological isolation is due to the differences in the number of chromosomes. Okay, so due to the differences in the number of chromosomes, the fertilization is not takes place. Okay, so in male cells, the number of chromosomes is different, okay, from the number of chromosomes of female sexes. Okay, so the number of chromosomes are present, difference, we can see some differences in the number of chromosomes. So because of this reason, the reproduction or the interbreeding is prevented. So this is called cytological isolation. Example, Rana catespina and Rana areata. So these two are the frog species. Then next, hive inviolability. So these type of isolation we can see in some fishes, frogs and beetles. Okay, so here hybrid inviability meaning the sperm's reproduction takes place. The sperm is a male sex cell. It is entering inside the female sex cell egg. Okay, so the sperm is entering inside the egg cell. Okay, then fertilization takes place. Fertilization takes place. Embryo also developed. Listen very carefully. Hybrid inviability meaning the male sex cell sperm is entering inside the egg cell. Fertilization takes place. Embryo is developing, but the embryo die before it reaches maturity. Before it reaches maturity. So this type of isolation is called hybrid inviability, and we can see this hybrid inviability in some fishes, frogs and beetles. Then next one is eighth isolation is hybrid sterility. Listen, here hybrid sterility means the hybrid, a new variety is formed because of reproduction, but it is sterile. Okay, so this condition is due to the failure of separation in the chromosome during the meiosis cell division. You all know during the meiosis cell division the chromosomes also separating their number. Okay, so if any failures occur, the hybrid is developed but it is sterile. For example, mule we can say, okay, is a sterile animal. Okay, it is developed because of the crossing of both donkey and horse. Understand of you? So hybrid sterility meaning hybrid is formed but sterile, unable to produce, sterile meaning unable to produce the young ones. The reason is the failure. Okay, the chromosome is not separated during the meiosis cell division. The chromosome is not separated properly. Understand of you? Then the last one is hybrid breakdown. Here hybrid breakdown meaning the first F1 hybrids are viable and fertile. This is normal, no problem. But the F2 hybrids are inviable and sterile. Inviable and sterile. Understand you? Understand my friends? So isolation meaning the separation of members of a single population into two or more subpopulation is called isolation. And because of some barriers or because of some reason, the interbreeding or the reproduction between the members of these two subpopulations are prevented. Understand of you? Understand? And now we have studied there are 9 types of isolation, and all these 9 types of isolations are divided, comes under 2 important categories. One is the pre-psychotic categories, pre-psychotic isolation, and the second one is the post-psychotic isolation. Understand of you? So there are 9 types of isolations are there. Ecological isolation, otherwise called habitat isolation, seasonal isolation, then sexual isolation, morphological isolation, physiological isolation, cytological isolation, hybrid inviability, hybrid sterility, hybrid breakdown. Understand, my dear students? So today we have completed only one question. It's very important 5-mark question for science group students. Okay, so all study today itself and send the answer to me. Okay, next class we'll meet. Thank you.